With our friend Stephen Wine as part of Brittany Parr's public programs, where we will be presenting Best Minds, how Allen Ginsberg made revolutionary poetry from madness. Tonight I will be your moderator, briefly introducing Steve and having his lecture for about 40 minutes, after which we will have a moderated Q&A and then an open floor for questions from the public. So I'll just briefly introduce Steve for those of you who hadn't had the privilege to know him. Stephen Wine is a psychiatrist, a researcher and an author. He's a professor of psychiatry at the UIC College of Medicine in Illinois, where he also is a director of global medicine and director of the Center for Global Health. For 30 years, he has been conducting research both with refugees and migrants in the United States and in post-conflict countries focused on mental health and violence prevention. He first came to Kosovo in 1999 and has been collaborating since with local mental health leaders and researchers. He's author of 3 books and more than 200 articles. He's here to talk about the last one, Best Minds, which I had the privilege to recently read for the second time. I look forward to speak further about it. Steve, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming here.
Thank you, Aras. So I first want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the organizers, Brittany Parr and Ligjërata and Floria and Exona. Thank you very much for your support. It means a lot. So I think here in Pristina, which is a place that knows of trauma and resilience, and we know we're in a time when it feels like the world is on fire. I think this is an excellent place to be talking about Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg was a legendary beat poet. He was born in New York in 1926. He died in 1992. This is him reading, I think, in 1964 in London. Here he is at the Human Being Festival in 1965 in San Francisco, and there he is being crowned the May King in a celebration in Prague in the mid-60s. So he's been all over the world. He's been to the former Yugoslavia, but I don't think to Albania or to Kosovo. But his poems have certainly been translated into Albanian. Here he is. Who's he walking with? Can you tell? Who? Yes, he's walking with Bob Dylan. They're visiting Jack Kerouac's grave in Lowell, Massachusetts. This is in the film Rolling Thunder Review. So, you know, in response to real world threats to freedom, you know, in the second half of the 20th century, Allen made revolutionary poetry. What's revolutionary poetry? That means he's pushing for freedom of speech. He's pushing for spiritual liberation, for sexual revolution, for gay liberation, for humanizing madness, saving the planet, world peace, changing consciousness, finding new ways of being human. These are the things that made Allen revolutionary. And I'd say no poem better expresses that than the poem Howl, which is one of his most famous poems, which came out in 1956. Let's listen just to a little bit of Howl. Howl for Carl Solomon.
Howl for Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night. who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz.
So the first line, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. This is the line that exploded the consciousness of the culture in the United States and globally. And isn't it interesting in that line, you can hear both that there's hardship and desperation, but there's also a sense of freedom there in madness. So there's both sides, and we'll be talking about that as we go on tonight. But Allen was tapping into something that other 20th century intellectuals and artists have, which is that madness can be a liberating force. Like the surrealist who created whole models of art around the notion of madness, that it could disrupt bourgeois consciousness, and also figures like William James, the philosopher, who in his varieties of religious experience thought that persons who experienced certain kinds of mental dysfunction might be amongst the most open to spiritual conversion, and so that there was value in that kind of experience. So we've known that for a long time that Allen himself had some experiences with mental health problems, and also that his mother, Naomi Ginsberg, did. She was diagnosed as schizophrenic. She was confined in hospitals. She had many disabling treatments. And Allen himself was hospitalized when he was a young man. And so there were multiple levels of involvement, personal and family involvement, with mental illness and with psychiatry. But what's so important is that instead of being crushed by these experiences, Allen somehow survived and also was able to imaginatively transform this into wonderful art and a kind of revolutionary consciousness. So how is that possible? How does someone do that? And what can it teach us today? I was incredibly fortunate to get to know about these matters because I reached out to Allen when I was 24 years old and a medical student at Columbia University in the 1980s. I literally wrote a letter to him asking some questions, trying to understand his take on these issues, and sent it to his publisher. And then I came home one night and there was a message from him on my answering machine. Do you remember answering machines? And the next day I spoke with him, and the next day after that I met with him. And so Allen was willing to answer my questions because, you know, as a famous person, as a celebrity, as a person who's kind of created himself in the public eye, I think that he lost touch with some of his earlier life experiences, and especially things involving his mother and mental illness. It wasn't very common for the doctors to talk to you about those things. So he had a lot of questions, and he was interested in me helping to learn more about that. So he supported me as a very young person to take this on. And he gave me access to his psychiatric records, to his mother's records, to his whole archives, his journals, things like that, which are incredibly valuable opportunities. And also, I got to interview him many times and other important people in his life. Now, if you know anything about Allen, you would know that Allen often spoke about his Blake visions, which he had in 1948, so when he was about 22 years old. And here's what he said: I heard a very deep, earthen, grave voice in the room, which I immediately assumed, I didn't think twice, was Blake's voice. We're talking about William Blake, the great artist and writer. And Allen, in having these visions, became like the son of Blake. Blake was like, he had his biological family, and then he had his literary family, his literary father. And this was how important this experience was. And I emphasize here that it came to him in the presence of a voice, he said. Now this quote comes from an interview that Allen did in the early 60s, 1960s. So that would be about 14 or so years after the actual visions. Well, when I started digging around in Allen's archives, it was clear to me that there was no mention of the voice until about 14 years after the visions. And I thought this is very interesting because this is a kind of moving target. It's a kind of evolutionary process of telling the story of the visions. And so I started to think about that. And I also came to learn that Allen's having the visions in 1948 really came in the context of a big crisis involving his mother, Naomi. Now, Naomi, I said, had severe mental illness. She was one of tens of thousands of people that in the 1940s was sent to state psychiatric hospitals in the United States and more or less disappeared. And so I also had a chance, in addition to learning about Allen, to learning about Naomi, this person who was made invisible and disappeared. So let's turn to Kaddish, Allen's other very famous poem, Kaddish for Naomi Ginsberg from 1962. This is his other great poem of madness. It's his elegy to his mother from 1961. It's widely regarded as Ginsberg's masterpiece. It's 4 parts on 36 pages. It would take me an hour and a half to read it to you. Ginsberg began writing Kaddish in Paris a couple of years after his mother died. It took him 5 years to write it. And then the majority of it was written in a 40-hour marathon in his apartment in New York City the following year. He said it, quote, burst from my hand in a day. Let me read a few lines from it. As I walk towards the Lower East Side, where you walked 50 years ago, little girl, from Russia, eating the first poisonous tomatoes of America, frightened on the dock, then struggling in the crowds of Orchard Street. Towards what? Towards Newark, towards Candy Store, first homemade sodas of the century, hand-churned ice cream in back room on musty brown floor boards, towards education, marriage, nervous breakdown, operation, teaching, school, and learning to be mad in a dream. What is this life? You could see Allen is tracing the geography of the Lower East Side of New York City. This is the place where immigrants would come. They would go to Ellis Island and they'd live in the kind of Jewish ghetto on the Lower East Side of New York. And that's also more or less where Allen was living those days. But he's telling the story in a very special way, I think, because it's really the story of an immigrant woman and how an immigrant woman was smashed by modernity. So her madness is not just an individual level problem that she had, but it's essentially a failure of modernity to take care of its poorest souls, like the immigrants from Europe come to New York. Kaddish bore witness to a world so full of crises and trauma and contradiction that it drove someone like Naomi mad. It said things about madness that had never been said before, and it documented it in very graphic and destructive ways. But at the same time, he clearly loves his mother. He presents her in a dignified way, and you really have a sense that this is a human being searching for meaning and trying to maintain her dignity amongst terrible situation. Let's see. I'm going to... Yeah, I'll play that in a minute. Allen, in that poem, even declares his mother as his muse. He says, "O glorious muse that bore me from the womb, gave suck first mystic life, and taught me talk and music, from whose pained head I first took vision. tortured and beaten in the skull. What mad hallucinations of the damned that drive me out of my own skull to seek eternity till I find peace for thee, O poetry, and for all humankind, call on the origin. So he makes an explicit connection between his visions and Naomi's visions. Well, let's talk a little bit more about Naomi. Naomi came from the Jewish Pale in the area of like Ukraine. Her family came, she came with her parents to Lower East Side of New York. The family had a candy store there. They were living like in a boarding house where lots of people passed through. One of my discoveries in this book, which Allen himself never got to learn, and I'm sad about that, but because it would have meant a lot to him, was that Naomi was sexually molested by a male boarder between ages 5 and 6 and 9. And we think that this is important in terms of what came after for her. So the idea that Naomi herself was a victim of violence, a victim of sexual violence, adds a whole other level of meaning to Kaddish and to thinking about madness. Well, she had a kind of normal immigrant childhood. The family moved to Newark, New Jersey. She attended grammar school and high school, and then she went to study to become a teacher, but she had her first nervous breakdown at age 18. She recovered. She met Allen Ginsberg. This is the man on the left there, who would become her husband. Lewis was a teacher and a high school principal in New Jersey. He was also an amateur poet, a published poet. And things were okay for some time, but she had another psychiatric collapse at age 35 and was admitted to another mental hospital, and then several year admissions followed. And during these times, she would be in and out of the hospital, mostly in the hospital. And when she was home, she was floridly psychotic, she was suicidal. She would often walk around the apartment nude, being openly paranoid. Allen was her primary caretaker as a child. Her parents eventually divorced. For some reason, Allen was the one who she really depended on, and Allen really was able to calm her and talk her down from her madness when she was having all these difficulties. But what a life that was for Allen. Now, I want you to fast forward to 1947, April 24th. A 51-year-old Naomi Ginsberg ends up in the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. Allen had to call the police to bring her there because she had gotten out of control. She enters into the examining room and she's kind of teetering on her feet. She's almost falling over. Her head is like jerking about on her neck in some kind of weird way. And sometimes she throws her head down like this and lets it hang there. And she says,
Now.
Oh, actually, I'll come back to that in a second. She said, I can't keep trying to hold on to a happy thought. And then she starts telling the story to the psychiatrist of her situation. She says, it all comes from my family. That's where my trouble started. Everyone knows my life. It's a case in history. My husband killed his brother and child. My husband is a well-known poet. I left him 4 years ago. I got tired. We separated. His mother organized a gang to get something in America for the Jews. They went wild with killing. So she has these kinds of delusions about her family. She also has visions of God. All of a sudden, a vision came to me when I first became sick. It said, have patience. It comes to the needy. I was so happy I tried to get him again. I can't endure the suffering. I feel as though I'm dead, but I'm not dead. Well, she ends up getting admitted from Bellevue to Pilgrim State Hospital. This is Pilgrim State Hospital, which is in Long Island, about 90 miles from New York City. At the time, in the 1950s, it held 13,000 patients. It was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world, if you can believe it. She would remain at Pilgrim State for the next 2 years. Not long after her transfer, Allen visited there and wrote nothing about his visit in his journal. When asked if she had been glad to see Allen and her family on visiting day, she said, "I feel sorry that they come and see this site. There's no hope for me. I want to die." She went to the nurses' station and asked them to euthanize her. She got some kinds of treatment that she got ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, which maybe helped for a little bit, but then eventually didn't help. She wrote to Allen a letter. She said, "For the love of Jesus, I do not know how I got this sickness. It's up to you to find out. Your loving mother, Naomi." I think he took this very seriously. And I think one could, in some ways, see his whole poetic career as a response to this request from his mother. Though he didn't, of course, approach it how a doctor or psychiatrist would. He approached it as a poet would. Here's a letter. She wrote many letters to Allen and his brother Eugene. Look at this letter. Look at how sad it is. Pilgrim State Hospital, dear Allen and Eugene, please come to see me in a hurry. One son call up the other son. Tell Eleanor, her sister, to come to see me. I'm still alive and walking around. Love, Naomi. Well, the doctors had a case conference at Pilgrim State Hospital. This is the record. And they said that she wasn't getting help from ECT, and so their recommendation was prefrontal lobotomy. Allen, this is the letter that was written to Allen from the director of the Pilgrim State Hospital, Dr. Harry Worthing. And it reads, "Please be advised that your mother, Mrs. Naomi Ginsberg, was seen in consultation with the assistant director, and it was decided that her mental condition is serious enough to warrant a prefrontal lobotomy. If you're interested in more details in regard to this type of operation and its possible complications, you can discuss this problem with the doctor in charge of the case of your mother on the next visiting day. In the meantime, we're enclosing a permit for the operation, which you can sign and return to us if you so desire." Allen is at the time 21 years old. He is a senior in college. He had actually just returned, he had been thrown out of college for something, and he had just returned from abroad, and he gets to his apartment and he sees this letter. What would you do? What would you do if you got this letter? Well, Allen went to the hospital the next day. He talked to the doctor, and he talked to the resident who was on call that day. And he remembers being told by the doctor that your mother will die unless you sign this, that her head will literally explode, and that you need to sign this. And so he did what he thought he needed to do, and he signed it, and the lobotomy was performed. At the time, lobotomies were being performed in great numbers in the United States, and especially in New York State, which had 1/5 of the nation's mentally hospitalized persons. And there are huge problems with the lack of ethics and science about lobotomy, needless to say. When Allen came home that day, he wrote in his journal simply, "Allen, don't die," after he had signed consent. This shows the lobotomy procedure in which a leucotome is inserted into a hole in the skull and then swept across the frontal cortex to sever the ties between the frontal cortex of the brain and other parts of the brain. And it was thought to be curative. This was thought to be psychiatry's miracle operation, like open heart surgery for heart disease. It was thought that they were going to cure mental illness and empty the psychiatric hospitals and return people to their homes. How wrong they were. Now, I want you to imagine what it was like for me at age 22 or something, to find this letter. I found this letter in Allen's archives, which he gave me access to. At that point in time, in 1986, there was no public knowledge that Allen Ginsberg had consented for the lobotomy of his mother. And I'm going to go on to explain why I think that's important. But as a public figure, as a celebrity, as a revolutionary poet, it's big stuff. And imagine how hard it was for me to show him that letter and to say, Allen, look what I found, and can we talk about this? And so I think the lobotomy changed Allen forever. And when I first showed it to him, he said, that's an extreme thing. He said, I had to do the signing for that. And then he asked, when was that exactly? And he realized that was about 6 months before he had his visions. And he said, there is a connection between that and the visions that I had. And then we talk more about that, and I include that in the book. Now, let's go back to that's a picture of Naomi, by the way, standing outside of Pilgrim State Hospital with her other son, Eugene, approximately a week before she died in 1956. Now let's flash back to Allen. So Allen graduates from high school at age 16 early. He's brilliant. He goes to Columbia University to become a labor lawyer, he thinks, and save the world. But instead, he gets very interested in literature and avant-garde literature. And these are the friends he meets. On the right is William Burroughs. In the middle with the cigarette is Jack Kerouac. On the left is Lucien Carr. These are like legendary figures of the counterculture. They're all there together at Columbia University as students. This is where it all began. And Allen and Jack Kerouac had the idea to create a new vision out of literature, to remake society. They thought society needs a fresh start after World War II, after the Eisenhower kind of bland cultural world. They want to shake things up. And what better to shake things up than a crisis? And for Allen, the crisis became the crisis of his mother. They were very inspired by Rimbaud, who said, as I came down the impassable rivers, I felt no more the bargeman's guiding hands. Nothing better than a crisis which shakes things up and disrupts your life to make you open in ways that you weren't before. So 6 months later, Allen starts having visions of his own. He was lonely, he was directionless, he was despondent. He was living by himself in an East Harlem apartment, which was a sublet from a friend of his who was a religious studies student at Columbia. He was studying a course on Cézanne by the famous art historian Meyer Shapiro. He would take the subway down to Museum of Modern Art and look at paintings. And this is a painting called Les Stacks by Cézanne. And he first looked at this painting in the museum, and he said he started to feel a shimmering. He started to feel unsteady, started to feel like he was going to collapse. And then he was also, at the time, reading a lot of visionary literature. William Blake, William Butler Yeats, St. John of the Cross, William James. All these books he found on this friend's apartment that he was subletting from. When the visions really came in force, he was reading this poem, William Blake's The Sick Rose. And that's why he called it his Blake visions. And this vision, which came on a particular day in June of 48, he said, took him by complete surprise and immediately became his reason for living. He told his friends, he told his father, he told people in bars, like, I've had a vision and everything is different now. Although the visions were very difficult for him to describe, he tried his best. They were inspiring, they were empowering, but they were also terrifying. He wanted to tap into the power of these visions, and he wanted to use poetry to spread the power and to change consciousness for everybody. In June of 1948, this is what he wrote to Jack Kerouac. I can't forget what I have seen. He didn't say heard, seen. Something dreamlike and white, Ardenesque, ghostly about us. The unreal has become for me the most real now. To Neil Cassidy, he said, I have had moments of absolute, valid, literal knowledge. I have seen the nightingale at last. He wrote visionary poems, like in the style of William Blake. This is one poem that I really love, and I think I'll read it. I dwelled in hell on earth to write this rhyme. I live in stillness now, in living flame. I witness heaven in unholy time. I room in the renowned city, am unknown. The fame I dwell in is not mine. I would not have it. Angels in the air serenade my senses in delight. Intelligence of poets, saints, and fair characters converse with me all night. But all the streets are burning everywhere. The city is burning, these multitudes that climb her buildings. Their inferno is the same I scaled as a stupendous blazing stair. They vanish as I look into the light. So, he's saying, like, I'm an eyewitness to the divine. Despite this wicked city that I'm living in, I can sense and I can believe in the presence of the divine. The more that he was living with this and trying to write these poems and trying to communicate, the more he felt himself that he was going mad. And he wrote in his journal, I am ill. I have become spiritually or practically impotent in my madness this last month. I suddenly realized that my head is severed from my body. And so he complained that he couldn't get it right in his poetry. His father and his friends thought that he was taking this too far. He was too obsessed with it. His father was especially worried, and he himself was worried that maybe he was developing schizophrenia like his mother. He decided to live with this guy, Herbert Huncke, who's another beat writer and poet. Huncke was a junkie and lived with a bunch of other junkies. But Allen had the idea, that I have to, again, separate myself from bourgeois society and live on the street, live with people on the margins to figure out what's real and not real. Well, lo and behold, his apartment became like a den for stolen goods. And one day they're driving a car across New York City, and they go the wrong way down a one-way street, and a police car follows them, and there ends up being a car chase, in which the car rolls over. Allen had also been carrying his journals with him, and so could you imagine the car rolls over, his journals go all over the street, and he gets arrested. Herbert Huncke ends up in Rikers prison. Allen, there's a front page story on Allen in the New York Times the next day. Columbia student embeds with gang in order to gather material for his novel. But Allen's father mobilizes, hires a lawyer, and this lawyer gets letters written from two very famous Columbia professors, Lionel Trilling and Jacques Barzun, who say that Allen is a brilliant guy and needs to be saved. And so they decide to arrange a psychiatric admission for him. And so he agrees to get admitted to the New York State Psychiatric Institute. While they're waiting for this admission, which took some time to arrange, he and Jack Kerouac, pictured here, wrote this humorous poem. All the doctors think I'm crazy. The truth is really that I'm lazy. I made visions to beguile them till they put me in the asylum. Kind of funny, I think. But they're making light of a serious situation. People were really concerned, and Allen was concerned about his situation. And Jack Kerouac wrote to him, on July 5th, 1949, his first day in the hospital, "I admire you for delivering yourself to an actual bug house. It shows your interest in things and people. Be careful while convincing the docs you're nuts, not to convince yourself. You see, I know you well." So from June 1949 to February 1950, he was admitted to the New York State Psychiatric Institute. That's a picture of it there. That's where I went to medical school. That's where this whole story started. The New York State Psychiatric Institute is a very different place from Pilgrim State, though they're both part of the same state mental health system. This is like the jewel in the crown. It's a collaboration with Columbia University. It's a major research institution. And so Allen is admitted to the 5th floor, which is referred to as the Genius Ward. It's a place where they do psychodynamic psychotherapy with people who have severe mental illness. Allen is given a Rorschach test. Here's the results of the Rorschach test, the summary. The patient is a brilliant but autistic schizophrenic, probably of the catatonic type, who has religious ecstasies and occasional agitated periods in which he can be destructive. He feels alternatively crushed by the world and in command of the world. His unconscious seems to be extremely conscious. The director of the hospital, or the research, was this guy named Paul Hope, a Hungarian-American psychiatrist who had devised the diagnosis called pseudoneurotic type schizophrenia. Nikki, I don't think you've heard of this diagnosis because it's not currently used as a diagnosis, but it was then, and it was meant to refer to people who have essentially a psychotic core covered up with a lot of neurotic behavior. In some ways, it's analogous to personality disorders or borderline, but it's not the same as borderline. And there's actually some people who are calling for this to be brought back in some ways. But the 3 clusters of symptoms were pan-neurosis, pan-anxiety, and pan-sexuality. Allen, I shared the diagnosis with Allen, and we read through his records together. And he said, "I like this diagnosis. It's good," because Allen believed that everybody has madness inside of them, and they should recognize it and understand it and tap into it. And so he was glad that this diagnosis acknowledged it. The scary thing is that even on that ward, they were doing psychosurgery. They were doing lobotomies on persons with pseudoneurotic type schizophrenia. So actually, Allen was in a group of people that was being considered for lobotomy. I interviewed the psychiatrists who worked with Allen, who were actually my teachers at the time when I was in medical school. And one of them told me that, like, I saw it as my job to protect people like Allen from being selected for lobotomy. So they were actually doing controlled trials comparing lobotomy versus psychotherapy to see which would have a better impact, if you can believe that. And they were also giving mescaline to patients. They would give mescaline. Guess what happens when you give someone mescaline? Ferried? Not good. And so they would give mescaline, and then they would give lobotomy, then they would give mescaline again. So there's a lot of cruelty going on here in the name of science. Allen went to art therapy. He drew this picture of the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River. And Allen was seen in psychotherapy 3 and 4 times a week, treated by psychiatry residents. So I ask you to name me another person, a brilliant young person at a key formative stage of their life, a brilliant poet, a brilliant artist, for whom we have the psychotherapy progress notes. So this is why I got very excited when I got access to this in my 20s. And this is an example of the notes, and you could see here that he's talking about his visions. The whole world had an intelligence running through it, he said. At 19, he began to search for a new vision outside of society and turned to antisocial activities such as drugs, free sexuality, and criminal behavior. Really interesting stuff. So let me just talk for a minute about his experience in therapy. One of the things he said in therapy was, "I am the greatest poet of my age." He said that to his therapist. What if you were his therapist? What would you say back to him if he said, "I am the greatest poet of my age"? Anybody? What?
What did you think?
Tell me about it. I mean, at the time, he was an unpublished poet. He believed in himself. But what was interesting is that the person he was seeing at the time, this therapist, was pretty kind of uptight guy. And the guy had there was a knock on the door. The psychiatrist left the room to answer some page or something. And when he leaves the room, Allen is looking at the notes that the guys wrote, and he sees that he wrote down, "I am the greatest poet of my age." And Allen says back to the therapist, "That sounds pretty paranoid the way you have it there, doesn't it?" So it was a kind of unwittingly great interpretation that got Allen to get some perspective on his grandiosity. But you know, grandiosity is a problem, and many people who are dealing with a psychotic break in their 20s experience grandiosity, and helping people to be able to manage that is really a big challenge. So it's not a trivial issue. And look at one of the therapists, you know, said kind of like, this is what they wrote: when it was suggested that the unusual intensity of his experience may be a state in which his usual intellectualizing defenses were not operative, Allen was disappointed. He wanted these to be considered special and prophetic states. I saw God. I heard the voice of Blake. Yes, I did. Are you telling me you agree? Yes. You know, I mean, he needed it confirmed. And so he was getting into all these struggles and with his therapist about that. And I think that what the therapists were kind of saying to him also is, okay, Allen, great. What are you going to do with that? It's about what are you going to do with that? How are you going to mobilize? What poems are you going to write? What are you going to do to share that with people? He also had the sense that there's sanity and there's insanity. It's bipolar, one or the other. There's no gray zone. And his mother was insane, and he was not, and everyone else is not. And he couldn't understand, how do I fit into this with my visions? He also talked about his mother exposing herself. At age 10, he remembered feeling tempted to look. He felt this was a seduction and that she demanded husbandly responses from him. Allen was struggling with being a gay young man who was more or less closeted and trying to figure out how to grow up as an adult with that. And one of the therapists said, "Does being homosexual mean having to take the extreme social risk you have taken?" And Allen said that one of the most helpful things that his therapist did was actually met with his father, a woman therapist, met with his father and said, "Look, Mr. Ginsberg, your son has a serious mental illness. We see his homosexuality as a symptom of his mental illness." And I want to be clear that that's how they thought about it in those days, as a symptom of mental illness. That's not how we think about it these days. But she said, it's a symptom, and just like any other illness, you have to support your son while he's recovering, and so you have to tolerate this. So you have to let him live in your home. You have to let him have his friends, and and just like work it out. And Allen said that was the single most helpful thing that did, and it wasn't exactly tolerance, okay, but it was for that day and age. In the end, they changed his diagnosis to pseudoneurotic type schizophrenia. Allen says they certified I was not mad, more of a real neurotic who is pseudopsychotic, you might say. That's what he told me. But in fact, and I write this in the prologue of the book, that they did a case conference on Allen, and Dr. Nolan Lewis, who is one of the most famous psychiatrists in the United States, interviewed him and basically said, this guy is going to become full-on schizophrenic within a few years. Well, it turns out they were wrong. And Allen did all right. So Allen asked for a room and quiet space and some pencils and paper to write poems in the hospital. So let's shift a little bit and let's talk about what he was doing poetically. At the time, he was really interested in this figure of the shrouded stranger, who was kind of like an urban boogeyman who would go around scaring people. And here's how it sounds. Who'll come lay down in the dark with me, belly to belly and knee to knee, who'll look into my hooded eye, who'll lay down under my darkened thigh. Allen actually read this at his first ever poetry reading at his case conference at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. But it's okay, he was in New York, he was in Manhattan, he was doing this reading. And his therapist thought this was a kind of breakthrough. Why? Because he thought Allen is representing poetically his terrifying and seductive, psychotic, suicidal, nude mother. And so he saw that as a kind of breakthrough. This is a figure of the shrouded stranger, and you could see all kinds of iconic literary and popular culture figures that Allen associated, like Edgar Allan Poe, Faust, Dr. K, Bowery Bum. The shrouded stranger was also an important figure to Jack Kerouac, and who wrote things about this in various books. And so Allen wrote journal after journal of shrouded stranger poems, but eventually concluded that they were heading nowhere. On the day after Allen gets released from the New York State Psychiatric Institute, he goes to hear this man. This is William Carlos Williams, very famous modern American poet at the time, who's also from his hometown, Paterson, New Jersey. You might have read Paterson. And he goes up to him afterwards, and there's too many people crowding around him, but then he gets to meet him later, and they go and have coffee together in New Jersey. And Williams says, "Show me your poems." And he shows him poems like The Shrouded Stranger, and Williams says, "These are useless. You can't write in that style. Don't write in that old lyrical English classical style that you learned from Columbia. You need to write in an open, free verse. Instead, what you need to do is look in your journals and see what you got in your journals." So he tells Ginsberg. Ginsberg then writes to Kerouac and Burroughs and Cassidy this: "All you got to do is look over your notebooks. That's where I got these poems. Or lay down on a couch. Think of anything that comes into your head, especially the miseries or night thoughts. When you can't sleep an hour before sleeping, only get up and write it down. Then arrange in lines of 2, 3, or 4 each. Don't bother about sentences and sections of 2, 3, or 4 lines each. We'll have a huge collected anthology of American kicks and mental museries." And so he gets very excited about that. Allen starts what he calls a stranger project. He takes the subway around New York City and walks on streets. He looks for people who are obviously like homeless and mentally ill and, out of it. And then he writes kind of portraits of them. So instead of writing about imaginary figures like the shrouded stranger, he's doing like urban ethnography. Thin, bony elite, passively mad, anciency of nobility, intelligence beyond ideas, completely beat, shifting nervously in her seat, continually agitated by her unknown mystery. There's something alive about that description. Allen draws in his journal this figure of a half skull that's half alive. And to me, and he writes these phrases: "Man who sees death or is half death, half knows. He who knows death knows he will die." And, when you think about it and you look at this that he's thinking about, he's really reflecting on the double-sided existence that he had always lived with his mother, with his severely mentally ill mother, half in the hospital, half at home, half crazy, trying to be human, and Allen trying to bridge those worlds. And then there were many, many, many other friends, such as the other beat characters, who were strung out on drugs, who were in and out of psychiatric hospitals, who were living out in the street, and who were in and out of criminal institutions. And so this whole idea of being on the margins, of what kind of special knowledge or special experience does that give you, was an obsession. And Allen wrote a poem this is just a line from it. Many a soul gone riding out on the path. Many a soul gone to the jail and prison and asylum. He's trying to tell the story of these people. How do you tell the story of these people? And then one day, he has moved to San Francisco. It's 1955. A few years later. What? Okay. And he finds this line that was in his journal, the top line. And he does what Williams tells him to do. I saw the best mind angel-headed hipsters damned. And he takes that line and he cuts it into two lines. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. Now in doing that is so interesting and so powerful, because he's taken this one phrase about madness that expresses that and really brought out the ambivalence. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. So, like, what is this all about? You know, it says, like, madness is destructive of our generation, but also madness may be one of the best things of our generation. Maybe it's conducive to what makes us the best, and maybe they're trying to destroy us for that. And so a whole complex web of situations opens up there. And as soon as that happened, he exploded. And he wrote in one marathon sitting the whole poem, Howl. And he told the story of that generation. And it's the poem that I shared with some before. And maybe let's just listen to a few minutes of it again. I'm going to just drop in somewhere else.
Unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire and paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley death, or purgatoried their torsos night after night with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and...
If you could tell, almost every phrase has both something very freeing and liberating, but also something very hard. And the lines really are in many ways documentary. Hallucinating Arkansas in Blake light tragedy among the scholars of war. That's Allen having his Blake visions at Columbia, who demanded sanity trials accusing the radio of hypnotism. That was his mother's delusions. Who threw potato salad at CCNY lectures on Dadaism and subsequently presented themselves on the granite steps of the madhouse with shaven heads and harlequin speech of suicide, demanding instantaneous lobotomy. That's Carl Solomon, who was the first friend that Allen made at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Allen introduced me to Carl, and I got to know Carl very well, and I talk about him in the book. He's an amazing guy and a poet and a writer himself. And what he's saying here is kind of course, absurd, but it's also true. Walter Freeman, the psychiatrist who did like 7,000 lobotomies in the United States, had letters from patients and family members requesting lobotomy. Please lobotomize me. Please lobotomize my loved one. And so there was a demanding of instantaneous lobotomy. But and then this line, and who were instead given the concrete void of insulin, metrazole, electricity, hydrotherapy, psychotherapy, ping pong, and agnesia, a lovely line. And Allen is throwing psychotherapy there under the bus. But the question that I want to ask, and to kind of wrap this up now, is like, what was the psychotherapy of value to him? How did that help him in his development as a young man, as a person who was flirting with psychosis and mental health problems, dealing with his mother's, the trauma of having consented for his mother, dealing with the legacy of a kind of child sexual abuse? And I think it did help him quite a bit. although I'm not sure that they actually knew how they were helping them, and we could get into that more if you want. But I just want to say, like, think about where Allen was in 1955 versus where he was in 1947. He had learned to be able to stay safe, to not get arrested, to not get thrown into Rikers, to not get killed. He was struggling with suicidality. He could have easily become a casualty, like many others of this class. He was able to work it out with his dad and his family about being with men. And he met a man, Peter Orlovsky, who became his lifelong partner. He learned to manage his grandiosity. He learned to be able to become the greatest poet of his age and not just brag about it. He learned to let his thoughts go spontaneously and to write in free verse. He learned to pivot from the more egotistical I witnessed to the more selfless and observant I saw, the more Buddhist I saw. He learned to get away from rigid dichotomous notions of you're either mad or you're sane, and to understand that there's a madness within us which is part of being human, and something we have to learn about and care for with reverence. So I think I'm gonna play just one audio and then close it up, and when we could have some dialogue. But this is the last part of Howl, or called Footnote to Howl. Let's just listen to a minute of this.
Holy the sea, holy the desert, holy the railroad, holy the locomotive, holy the visions, holy the hallucinations, holy the miracles, holy the eyeball, holy the abyss, holy forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith, holy, ours, bodies, suffering, magnanimity. Holy the supernatural, extra intelligent, brilliant kindness of the soul.
Thank you, Allen. Okay. I don't think it's on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the book, and thank you for the talk, Steve. I'm a bit overwhelmed with the questions I prepared and the questions that pop up in my head. Just too interesting for me personally. But speaking of personally, this was a very personal project to you as much as a professional one. It took somewhat 35 years, and I feel like you carried it in your head for a long time. While reading the book, I would see both your empathy towards the person, your sense of responsibility, as well as in many ways how you became his kind of psychiatrist. You did say that you would write this book after Allen will pass, but why it came out now? How did that process go? At times it also felt that it was written under his gaze. So what was the process like for you, and also what did you learn out of this journey?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I lived with this book all my life, and it made me a better person. It made me who I am. It made me into the kind of person who could write this book. And I think that if you read the book, you'll really understand that I first don't do a reductionistic psychiatric number on Allen, and nor do I do a Foucaultian attack on psychiatry. I'm really trying to understand the human experience of living with serious mental illness and the striving for dignity and purpose in life, and so also I had to learn a lot of things. When I'm handed the progress notes of Allen from psychotherapy, well, I didn't know how to do psychotherapy. I felt like I need to learn how to do psychotherapy in order to have a proper perspective to understand what happened to him. One whole chapter of the book tells that story. But I also felt like I needed to understand what it meant to walk with William Blake, what it meant to feel like you had William Blake as your father. I talked with Patti Smith about that. Patti Smith, who's a mentee of Allen's and a collaborator of Allen's, and who said that this was extremely important to Allen to make this connection. And so I was trying to hold in balance the literary side and the psychiatric, scientific side in a more human framework. And, you know, forgive me if it took me 30 years to do that. COVID helped me to finally write the book. I didn't want to like force myself to write the book on some time schedule for my academic career, you know, and I've been busy doing other things like coming to Kosovo. So when I was visiting you, Farid, and working with you, and we were building community mental health together in Kosovo, I was working on Allen in the Grand Hotel at night, thinking about this. So some things take time.
Yeah, it was worth your while. So let's get to very basic questions. I leave the more complex one to the whole room of psychologists, psychiatrists, and students that we got here. I'm sure they have many questions. So madness is something we've overheard in life, a notion we use, and most of us have a sense or idea or experience about either ourselves or the people around us. How would you describe madness, not only as a psychiatrist, but when you look at it with both eyes, as you say in the book, with a broader way? And does it have a use or a place in creativity, which was your initial quest? How do you learn to live with it and make it work for you?
Well, you know, madness in one word, it would be unreason, you could say. But it's many things, and it's many-sided. And if you, you know, I mean, first thing, we have the whole history of society trying to control it and contain it, and trying to help people who are suffering from it, but in times in very punitive and not humanistic ways, hopefully nowadays in a more humanistic and supportive way. But, you know, I think that madness can be many things at the same time. It can be illness, it can be dysfunction, but it can also be exhilaration, it can be freedom, it could be sexual ecstasy, it can be intoxication, it can be religious fervor, it can be conversion, it can be artistic expression. And I think that looking at it from that multi-side point of view is key. And that's one of the things that I think Allen came to see, and that madness is not just one thing, and that at the same time it can be both liberating and very constrictive and destructive. Think of Howl, which is like the mad flock. He's celebrating the madness of the flock that is freeing itself from the shackles of society. But then think of Kaddish, his mother, you know, his mother's odyssey dealing with severe mental. Hello, okay. And so Allen did not romanticize madness, importantly, nor did Blake. He saw all those sides, and he wants us to see those sides. He is a voice for humanizing madness. So I think one interesting thing to contemplate for the mental health professionals in here is like, what was the legacy of that? I think Kaddish itself, I understand as maybe the first ever family narrative of serious mental illness. Like, what's it like to be a family member of someone with serious mental illness? Just putting that story out into the culture is so important, because these were stories you didn't talk about. You know, you were ashamed of that. And he's saying no, and he's saying, and my mother, you know, she tried to be the best mother she could, and she tried to find God, even though she was stuck in a psychiatric hospital. So Allen's putting that out in the culture then inspired psychiatry, some psychiatrists, people who became known as anti-psychiatrists. R.D. Laing, for example, said that Kaddish and Howell were huge inspirations to him in developing his alternative approach. Well, anti-psychiatry went its own way, but what's the legacy of that? The legacy of that are things like the consumer movement in mental health, which says that people need to care for themselves. People with mental illness should be the providers or practitioners of other people with mental illness. Something shouldn't be done to us. We should do something for each other. And the whole notion of lived experience, and now you have groups formed around hearing voices. The idea that you should not be medicated for hearing voices, that it's okay to hear voices. Killing someone is not okay, but hearing voices, okay. And so, and there are a lot of people who are reshaping the mental health movement, the whole experience of receiving support and services with plans that I think really go back to Howell and Kaddish. So there's a legacy.
Thank you. So one thing is, what does his case also speak about intergenerational trauma and also the effect of external generational factors like wars, migration, different epidemics and other external factors, and how they may burden one in health? And also one other thing, I see a lot of coping with trauma and at the same time with living with a mentally ill. He's at the same time a caretaker, a victim, but also someone who's at fault or feels guilty about his role in it. What would you say about that?
Well, I think for Allen, madness is not an individual condition. It's a social condition. And I would say madness in Kaddish is a social diagnosis. So, as I said before, he's seeing Naomi's own tragedy as a product of society, as a product of the war, nuclearism, concentration camps, genocide, migration, poverty, and so he very much sees it as a collective process and as a culmination of high social adversity. I don't have to tell anyone in Kosovo about that, do I? You guys know that story. And so, I think that resonates very much with present day understandings of these matters. But, he's also saying that through these experiences, through becoming aware and connecting and healing, that there's possibilities for new ways of being human. And I think that that's what Allen is trying to open up. And that's what's in a lot of his poetry, not just these poems about madness. There's something very, very empowering and mobilizing and inspiring in a lot of his work. So Allen had a lot of trauma, you could say. And you could say there was intergenerational trauma. The trauma of being a caregiver, the trauma of losing your mother to lobotomy, the trauma of consenting for lobotomy, the trauma of, let's say, inappropriate parental sexual behavior with him, and she herself was a victim. So, there was a lot of trauma. Interestingly, the word trauma doesn't appear in the psychiatric records. It wasn't the way that they thought it. No Columbia psychiatrist, and they were the best, probably the best in the country, would ever conceive of the world that way. They used the term genital shock. He was suffering from genital shock, which means something like you see your parents naked. But nonetheless, they let him tell his story, and I think they didn't add to his sense of shame. And they had a sense like, okay, get on with it, And I think that was somehow helpful to him. Allen had complicated relationships. He had a lifelong partner, but they also had separate relationships, and not until later in his life was Allen kind of more settled and happy in love. And one might say that he had, let's say, relational issues that he carried through his life that were never addressed in this therapy or the other ones he had. And one other particular thing that I'd emphasize is that every single day, no matter where he was, he thought of his mother, and he thought of what he did to his mother, and he thought of how he couldn't save his mother, and he felt incredibly guilty about that. And this was a driving force for him, but it was also torturous. So imagine me sitting with him and talking with him about this, and he's like the king of the world, and I'm like this student, and he's in a lot of pain. I could feel his pain, and it made it very hard, Aris, for me to share this with him, to talk with him, and I really felt like I was creating problems for him, and especially when I found out about some of the more troubling things, that's where I decided that I don't feel comfortable putting this stuff out there while he's alive, and I'm going to wait until he passes, because I don't feel it's my place to change his life experience. That was the call I made. The downside of that is that he didn't get to see all of it, and I feel bad about that. But one makes your choices.
I have way too many questions, but maybe I will do another one or two and leave the floor to the participants. One thing I'm curious about, the world is quite mad, I might say, nowadays, with all the violence, the sort of digital omnipresence of atrocities, and also sort of a feeling of some sort of demise or some sort of collapse and hopelessness. So it feels like the right time to have a new visionaries, and I think you've had this particular access to Allen even more than one therapist, but had a whole. What do you think his new vision would be like today? What would he be advocating for?
I don't know. I would love if Allen were here to share that with us, but Allen was writing in the very turbulent 60s, for example, a time of great social upheaval. And what was his solution then? What was he proposing? He was proposing that everybody above age 14 take LSD. He actually thought that the world needed a mass nervous breakdown. He thought that paranoid forces had been unleashed by the government, by the media, propagating the Cold War, propagating the war in Vietnam, and we needed to shatter that. And LSD was going to shatter that. And he saw LSD as the consciousness changer. He met with Robert Kennedy a few weeks before he was assassinated. And he said, I got to take LSD, you got to get your brother and Khrushchev to take LSD, and the Cold War will be over. Well, isn't it interesting? What are people doing now with microdosing LSD at a level of, it's been shown to be evidence-based effective in treating PTSD and depression, and also in changing consciousness. So, I think Allen was onto something. I'm not proposing that's the answer, but it may be part of the answer. And I think that Allen and Leary, who led the psychedelic revolution, went overboard, and maybe today there's more judicious ways of doing that. But I think what you're saying, Aris, what Farid and I were talking about, is the world's on fire, systems are broken, leaders are lost, and dividing one another. And Allen was looking for new language, new forms of expression, new ways of understanding ourselves in the world through poetry, and so I guess I don't want to discount the importance of arts and poetry as a way of helping us to avoid extremism, avoid terror, avoid killing, avoid coming apart.
Thank you. We'll keep maybe brief.
More, then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to choose because I have two questions. One is about here, and one is about psychiatry. Which one should I go for? Yeah, I'll make
Just
those.
go.
So, okay. First one is so Allen was quite involved in advocacy, in anti-psychiatry movements, in having his own understanding and interpretation of psychiatry in the field. What do you think he would appreciate about what's going on with psychiatry nowadays, and what he would be against and trying to push against currently?
I write about that in the epilogue. I think that in many ways the things Allen was looking for have come true. For example, he was a family caregiver. Now we pay much more attention to the family and mental illness and how to support families. He was calling for attention to collective experience and social experience and cultural experience, and in many ways to do that. LSD, as I said, Allen was actually not anti-psychiatry. R.D. Laing was anti-psychiatry, but Allen believed in psychiatry. He believed in the importance of a humanistic, scientific approach to treating mental illness. That's why he took me on as a mentee. He could have dismissed me if he didn't believe in that, but he didn't believe in forced hospitalization. He didn't believe in confinement and constriction. So I think that I wrote a piece last year about the situation in New York City where Mayor Adams was advocating forced hospitalization and medication for people on the streets. And I thought about what would Allen think of that. And I think Allen would be very mixed about that. And so the whole notion of drug courts and forcing people to get medication, I think would be problematic for him. But I'm not sure. I think he'd want us to really have that argument and understand, is it truly going to deliver people to a better place? The better place is not confinement in hospitals. So mixed picture, but one of the things I try to do is get young psychiatrists and psychologists and others to read Allen, because I think it's really important to be in touch with this whole way of exploring the experience of mental illness and psychiatry, and to be reflective on the things we do. The colossal human rights violation of lobotomy, which everyone at the time thought was the absolutely right thing to do, turned out to be criminal and extremely destructive. And psychiatry has to this day not apologized for that in any meaningful way. So, who knows what mistakes we're making right now, but we should never be beyond thinking about those things. Ask your second question.
This is my last one. Well, you have a deep understanding of what people of Kosovo have gone through, the experience of the violence, the war, the sexual violence, all of the traumas, and sort of living with a madness that we talk very little about and accept a little. That is also like a baggage or like a luggage behind the current anxieties and uncertainties that are of a more global shared level. Maybe both what can we learn from Allen's ways of coping and understanding and turning that into a strength of sorts. He was both delaying confrontation but then also triggering tension and transforming this agitated state into something.
Yeah.
How can we cope also at a more societal community level, and how can we make this somehow work for us despite it being a really painful accumulation of experience?
Yeah, there's a lot of painful accumulation, and it takes a lot of capacities and strengths to be able to manage that. I don't think I've fully communicated one thing, which is that Allen had a very supportive network of friends. Those guys, William Burroughs and Kerouac, who are all committed to working with one another, to loving one another, supporting one another, pushing one another on, whether it's in literature or in culture or just in their lifestyle, but they were in it together for life. And having that network and not being isolated was so important. And having and being in a network that validated them and that didn't shame them, that didn't isolate them. But it said, you belong, you have a voice, and you need to tell your story to help the world to get to know itself better. I think that's so important. And I think that Allen was a spiritual seeker. And Allen grew up as a Jew, but he was never given a formal Jewish education. Allen belonged to all religions. He was a great follower of the Christian saints. He practiced Buddhism. He went to India and lived for several years and studied with good gurus there. Allen wanted to learn from all spiritualities to understand how we can connect with the divine, how we could honor the divine in our lives, how we can use that to make the world a better place. And so that openness, that thirst for knowledge, so important. Allen was extremely involved, obviously, in literature and in arts. He took great inspiration from this. This, he said, was the greatest painting he ever saw in his life. Okay, Fra Angelico's The Annunciation, where you see the Virgin Mary having the Immaculate Conception. The beam of God is coming into her and Christ is being conceived in her belly. But on the other side is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in a way, this painting was so important to him, and it became an artistic model for how he could communicate his visions. So he ended up communicating his visions like Fra Angelico's vision here. And so find it anywhere. Find it in literature. Find it in film. Find it at DocuFest. Find it in spirituality. Connect your suffering to another model of somebody who searched and found, and let them help give you strength.
Thank you, Steve. Now I would like the audience to come up with questions. There is a bit of too much light, but maybe if you can.
Hello?
See, the thing is, I can't see you because of light. So
Right
if you
here.
could step, where are you?
Yep.
It's so hard to see.
Well,
Come up, if you could.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, don't be shy.
yeah, right
Just
here.
come and stand over here, because there's a bright light that I can't see anything out there. If you come here, literally right here,
Yeah,
in front of Ferried will be nice to you. And
I'm
there.
sure.
Okay, thank you.
My question was, considering the political awareness of Allen Ginsberg, he was anti-capitalist, he was anti-heteronormativity. It seems to me, Howl is one of my favorite poems, but I haven't been able to, well, I don't know much about his activities outside of poetry. So it seems to me like he would fit in quite well with the anti-psychiatry movement. And I also, while I'm here, I have to kind of contest the explanation of the label that you previously gave for Lang and the rest, because I don't think, based on their writings, that anti-psychiatry can be characterized as not believing in psychiatry. To paraphrase, for example, Basaglia in Italy, he was against psychiatry as an institution, but not necessarily against the practice of psychiatry. He was against forced coercive treatment.
The regime of lobotomy and confinement.
Exactly, but also the way, in the faculty in terms of the way that it contributes to capital. So my question is, did Allen Ginsberg have, especially considering that during the time when he was active, a lot of these movements were also actively resisting institutional psychiatry, did he have contact with these groups? Did he also contribute to the cause in one way or another?
Good question, and I agree with your characterization of anti-psychiatry, and in many ways I'm very fond of that movement and what it's contributed. But Allen left that aside, and it's very interesting. After publishing Kaddish in the 1960s, he goes on to become a kind of global activist. He's into the anti-war. He's into anti-racism. He's into free speech movement. He's into gay liberation. He's into sexual liberation. He's into, LSD, psychedelic revolution. He's into anti-authoritarianism. But he's not into mental health. I think he just left that to others. I think he did his part in letting it loose culturally, but he had other things to do. And of course, he became a teacher. He became a teacher. He founded the Naropa, the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa University, and he taught for years and years there, and then he later taught at Brooklyn College. And there are thousands and thousands of people out there who learned from Allen. And I think that this is an important shift also from essentially having his mother at the center of his life towards shifting to his father at the center of life and becoming a teacher like his father. And I think it gave him a sense of stability and purpose and a way of kind of like connecting with a younger generation that he couldn't have otherwise done. So that was where he really, really invested. But very good question. Please, any questions? It's not on.
Sorry. Do you find a relationship between him not wanting to end up in prison and those very tendencies to challenge the psychiatric system at the time? As we can see through the psychotherapy notes, he was really playing with the limits of psychiatry, and at the time he was risking ending up being performed a lobotomy too. And as he was under arrest, I just wanted to get your insights in whether there was a relationship between taking the risks because of being under arrest at the time. Thank you.
I'm not sure I got all of that, but I'll try. First thing, Allen took great risks. Allen took great risks throughout his life. And this is he had incredible courage to go to the mental hospital, to go to the place where his mother was, to be there next to people who were being lobotomized and who were suffering greatly. And a million other times in his life. in his travels around the world, his support for unpopular political causes, in his support for the mentally ill, and his support for gay liberation. Allen was thrown out of Czechoslovakia. Allen was thrown out of Cuba. Allen was followed by the FBI. And so Allen was aware of the risks and took risks, and thank God he did. He challenged himself, and he challenged all of us to come up with better responses than punitive, authoritarian, shaming responses. I think it was, but back to the choice to go to PI, I think he felt very guilty at some level that he didn't end up in Rikers, and I think he felt very guilty that he didn't end up at Pilgrim State. He ended up at the elite New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I think he felt burdened. Well, this has been a gift to me. I have to make something of this, and I have to give back through this gift that I've received. I have to give that forward to others. And, it just reminds us of the contradictions and the hypocrisy in our own mental health system. I could just speak in the United States. If you're a poor person, you're not going to get the same care as if you're a rich person. Access to services is really, really bad. And the largest mental health system in the United States is the criminal justice system. Most people end up in prison, not in mental hospitals. So we are still not doing the job we need to do in terms of addressing people's needs and addressing the what we would call is the structural violence that undermines, that drives suffering and that undermines people getting the care they need. And I think Allen would be very attentive to those issues which still exist today. How about one more? Anybody else? Jerry, do you have one?
I'm waiting, maybe somebody will.
I see one. Okay. There's one behind you. Okay.
Hi, hello. I was just wondering, like, from the perspective of a researcher, from your side, like you were mentioning you were a student, 21-year-old or something. So, what was your drive, your inspiration? How did you think about Allen and reaching out and all that entire process? Could we know more about that?
Thank you. Good question. Well, I learned about Allen when I was in junior high school. I was at the Southfield Public Library, and I was not studying what I should have been studying, and I was looking around, and I found Kaddish and Howell on the shelf, and I started reading those, and they hit me like a bolt of lightning, and I thought they were as great as rock and roll. They were as great as Bob Dylan and the Beatles, but in a whole different way. And I was hooked, and I read Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs and all the beat writers, and they were my path into lots of self-knowledge and different ways of looking at the world. And I became an American Studies student in college. And I was always which means I was multidisciplinary in my approach. I could never be the slave of one way of looking at the world. So I was interested in history and literature and sociology and anthropology, political science, and I was interested in suffering. I was interested especially the psychological problems that came as a result of social problems. My heroes were also people like Robert Coles and Robert Lifton, famous psychiatrist who studied suffering and mental transformation amongst things like war and civil rights movement. And so by the time I came to be in medical school, I'm thinking about maybe being a psychiatrist, and I have questions, and then I go back and read Howell. I've seen The Best Minds of My Generation Destroyed by Madness, and then I see Allen was a patient at the very place where I'm now studying psychiatry, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. And then I look for everything written about that experience, and I can't really find anything. So I did the audacious thing of writing Allen a letter, and it was a pretty good letter. I still have it. I could show it to you if you want. And I just put my thinking down on paper. And my advice to you would be, to any of you, sometimes, when you're a young person and you can ask big, audacious questions, and put them in front of somebody who might seem inaccessible and so high, but they're very grateful for those kinds of questions. And maybe it's a question that a professor of psychiatry would never ask them, but a student, and they're open to it. So, I would never hesitate to encourage you to try to do that. But so I had a lot of questions. I didn't know where I was going to lead, and lo and behold, it connected. And so many years later, I learned from Allen's secretary, Bob Rosenthal, that Allen had an immediate sense of trust in me. And Allen was a very quick read of people, and he sensed that he could trust me. He could trust me to work with him, not to do a fast number on this, and to really try to understand the human experience, and to respect the literary and spiritual and all these other perspectives on it. And so somehow I had that in me. But it's like most everything else that happened in my life, such as coming to Kosovo and meeting Farid many years ago. And the way I say that is a complete accident, but I was prepared for it, I was prepared for it because of the things I had read and the things I had thought about and the questions that I had formed in my mind. And so when these things drop into your life, you can greet it with some compassion and intelligence and purpose, rather than just being random. And I think that that's really what I learned from that. Thanks for that question.
Hello. First of all, I want to say thank you for this wonderful presentation. I myself am not a psychology student or something like that. I'm more of an artist, so I was wondering, during one of the sessions that Allen was, one of his doctors mentioned that he was suffering from a very conscious unconsciousness. So my question is to you, do you think that when we become very conscious of things, when we become very consciousness of life or our own unconsciousness, do we run the risk of kind of flirting with madness?
Yes, and you are also accessing potential valuable knowledge and emotions and experience that are otherwise denied to you. Allen, for example, kept unbelievable dream journals throughout his life. He dreamt every night, and every day he would write those dreams. Those dreams became the seeds for many of his poems, and other creative works. So he tried to cultivate that. He tried to cultivate, access to other forms of consciousness through prayer, through meditation, through drugs, through through travel. He was always trying to disrupt the quotidian, the everyday, the kind of shade that society is trying to limit your knowledge of yourself and of the world. He was a great disruptor in that sense, and so in that, you know, that is risky business, but that doesn't. But that, and he was willing to pay that price, and he paid that price. But at the same time, he, as I said, he surrounded himself by supports and structures that by which he could manage that. So I don't think Allen would not say there's only one way to make art, or there's only, everybody has to go for madness, but he would say that that is a way, and that is a series of practices, and he very much also referenced the practices of other artists, such as the Surrealists, such as the Russian supremacists, who have also similarly looked to the experience of mental illness, severe mental illness, as a source of inspiration. And you could find but you can also find in the beats, in the writings of Jack Kerouac, for example, other kinds of guidance for how to approach this, which Kerouac ultimately framed in Buddhist terminology. One of the classic claims of that is first thought, best thought, and he practiced what they called spontaneous bop prosody. They're trying to, Allen saw himself and Kerouac saw himself as trying to transcribe the language of the brain without, kind of like without social structures imposing on it. They're trying to understand how the brain communicated with itself, and felt that the more improvisational, the less cognitive, the better. Okay, one more question. Farid? Oh, so, I'm sorry, I don't see. Go ahead.
Take both questions and then you make a closing. Okay.
Okay.
It's 9 o'clock.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for this amazing lecture. It was very reflective, and I guess what I got from your lecture was this connection between creativity and madness. And I really wanted to ask you, especially regarding Allen's case, do you think that going through madness or going through trauma makes us more vulnerable and more attentive to social truths, which can be portrayed in this art? Because it feels like what Allen did was portray these deep, hurtful social truths, and that's why they have so much meaning to most of us.
I love what you just said. That was great. And I'm going to respond to the first part of it. I think that what you said in the second part is great, and it is a great way of understanding what Allen did and so many other great artists working in the same idiom have done. I'm not really taken by the creativity and madness dialogue out there. I think that there's some kind of like romantic understanding that madness leads to creativity, and in that sense we might say, well, Allen was mad and he was creative, and it's the same thing. It's not, and I think you've heard me, and you understand that. You know, he was, in a way, close to madness. He had some psychotic-like experiences. He was traumatized, he was a caregiver. But it was, in a way, being close to it, being witness to it, being a part of it, but also being able to step outside of it and connect that to art and spirituality and other things that made a difference. So don't come away with some simple romantic notion that creativity comes from madness, or that madness is just one unitary thing. So I hope I've sufficiently complicated that picture through my study of Allen. Okay, thank you for that, for sharing that thought.
Steve, very inspiring, really, and opening different perspectives of thinking. From the first one, as one of the greatest contribution for destigmatization of the mental illness at that period of time. That was, I think, large contribution, and that approach and qualifying as the humanization of madness is really our efforts that are remarkable and worth being a part of history in this in the field of psychiatry. What for me is interesting, what I would like to hear from you is that you mentioned that the importance of the spirituality in the life of Ginsberg, and we heard the last sentence where he is addressing the soul as a holy and with divine characteristics. My interest is how much has Ginsberg in these creative efforts to address his madness and his psychotic problems rely upon his spirituality. How much was that part of the process of facing the psychosis that he was suffering? Because he was obviously looking at his illness as illness. So he was seeing that as something is going wrong. And he was trying different ways of facing that reality that he was living. How much was spirituality a tool in his efforts to face adequately this challenge?
Very much, and it was one of the central and defining struggles and searches of his life, and he stayed with it throughout his life. So at the time, at first he thought, I've seen God, I've connected with Blake, and I just got to write poems and share this with everybody. But then saw that wasn't happening, and that he was getting himself into trouble, and people were telling him, shut it down. And even the psychiatrists were saying, to a certain extent, take a distance from that, cool off on that. And so he did. He distanced himself, and he said, I'm going to give up on that and put it away and focus on other things. But then he came back to it, and he kept studying, and he kept going around the world. He traveled the world searching for gurus. He went to India, he went to Israel, he went to Europe. He was trying to get in touch with all persons of faith and to learn from them. And he kept coming back to that experience, and he kept reworking it. And in a very important moment, again, it happened when he saw this painting in the Prado on his first visit to Europe in 1957, I think. And that's what allowed him to finish Kaddish. So, he kept working on that. So, but his sense of spirituality was a very fluid sense. It was not, restricted to any one religion. If he owed the most of anything to Buddhism, to Tibetan Buddhism, which he practiced a lot in the second half of his life. So I think if you read his journals, if you read his poems, if you read some of his lectures, you'll get a sense of how he approached that. And I think that people find great inspiration and value in both in what he found, but also just in the search. So I guess that's it. Aris, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to wrap it up. I just want to let you know that a very select number of books is available for purchase there, and Steve will be gladly signing it for you. I recommend you take them, and the ones who don't, share them with your friends. So thank you for coming and staying with us until now. Steve, thank you very much for joining in this conversation, being so generous. Thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.